So my name is Christina Lamb and I'm Chief Foreign Correspondent for the Sunday Times, and I also write books. So I've been a foreign correspondent for, I think, 34 years, mostly covering war and conflict. I started off in Afghanistan when the Russians were there and ended up going back to Afghanistan a lot, but many other places: Iraq, Syria, South Africa, Colombia, Brazil, many places. And so, and then I've written books about Afghanistan and Pakistan. I've written books about what it's like being a refugee. I wrote a book with Malala. I am Malala. My most recent books, I did a book about war rape because I felt very strongly that as a correspondent I was covering more and more women being raped and more, and I can understand why it was happening so much. And then my last book, which came out a couple of months ago, was called The Prince Rupert Hotel for the Homeless, and that is a book about a hotel that took in around 100 homeless people during lockdown, during the pandemic, and took people who'd been living on the streets into this 4-star luxury historic hotel, and the owner and manager and accountant all moved in as well to look after them. And so it's the story of what happened. So I'm normally a foreign correspondent, but during COVID, of course, I couldn't travel. So I started reporting on my own country. And so actually this is the first book I've done that is about the UK. And I was reporting very much on the human cost of the pandemic. My work's always about telling people's stories and often about difficult issues. And I was really intrigued about how the pandemic and lockdown affected people differently and exposed inequalities and exacerbated them. And so one of the things that I looked at was what happened to homeless people during the pandemic. And there was a program called Everyone In by the government, which was to take all rough sleepers off the streets literally by the weekend within 2 or 3 days. And they put them in hotels because the hotels were empty as there was no tourists. Mostly they put them in budget hotels or B&Bs, but then I came across this hotel in Shrewsbury, which was very different, which was a 4-star hotel that parts of it were 900 years old and almost as old as this house. And instead of normal regular guests, had homeless guests. And so how that all worked, and I was just very interested in telling that story. I actually went and lived in the hotel with the homeless people, which was quite good for me because they couldn't escape me. And I mean, some didn't want to talk about their backgrounds, others really did want to talk and they didn't have much else to do. Many of them were wary because they'd been treated badly by people for years, but it was just a real insight in a way that if I just normally decided to write a book about homelessness, I would have gone to shelters or talked to people living on the streets. But this way I was actually living with them, meeting them every day. They got used to me, and so I was able to hear their stories in a very different way. And it was a real insight for me and also for the hotel people, you know, that some of the people were very challenging. They were addicts, they were drug addicts, alcoholics, some had mental health issues, many had been abused as children. And there were also people where just one bad thing had happened to them. Their relationship had ended or they'd lost their job and suddenly everything spiraled and they found themselves living on the streets. So I spent most of my life in really bad places where bad people were doing bad things to other people. But the reason that I keep doing it is because actually in those bad places you often find people doing amazing things and you find the brightest lights in the darkest places, I guess. And often those people seems to be women. And so I was lucky enough to work with Malala, who, as you know, was shot by the Taliban in Pakistan for just because she thought she should be able to go to school as a girl, which of course she should. But also I've worked with many people in different countries doing incredible things, whether it's a beekeeper from Aleppo who rescued hundreds of Yazidi girls who'd been captured as sex slaves, judges in places like Zimbabwe who risked their life to try and save people from the repressive regime and get them off often trumped up charges, and again at often great personal cost. And I think I've also learned, Malala says one book, one child, one pen, one teacher can change the world. And I think it's easy to be overwhelmed by all these things and think we can't do anything, but actually I see over and over again that one person can make a difference. Might seem a small thing that they're doing, but it is changing things. My Afghanistan, where I just came back from, where people were risking their lives running secret schools for girls.